how the West was settled after Confederation took place and the railway was built. This is the 8th lesson in our series of the history of Canada in 10 lessons. Let's get started. We're going to start by reviewing using our Lesson 7 notes. So the blank community lived mainly in what is now Winnipeg, Manitoba. They were led by blank blank. And then Manitoba joined Canada in, and then a year goes here, and BC joined in blank after it was promised a blank from C to blank. So what I'd like you to do now is I encourage you to pause the video, go back and look at your Lesson 7 notes, and see if we can remember who should fit, what word should fit in each one. So pause now. Okay, let's check and see if your answers are correct. So it is the Métis community. The Métis community lived mainly in what is now Winnipeg, Manitoba. They were led by Louis Riel. Now, if you remember, the Métis were, that word means mixed, and they were mostly a mix of kind of Indigenous and French, primarily French settlers who had children together and they kind of formed their own nation. Manitoba joined Canada in 1870, and BC joined in 1871 after it was promised a railway from sea to sea. Great, so now that we've done that review, let's pick up our story. So Prince Edward Island joined Confederation in 1873, so that's this island over here, it's part of the Maritimes, and the British gave the Arctic Islands, so these ones up here, to Canada in 1880. Of course, they did not ask the Indigenous residents of these islands, the Inuit, who lived independent from British control. Now, in the 1860s and the 1870s, the West was a wild place. Before the railway was built, the West, as we know, was occupied mostly by the Métis and the Indigenous Plains people, who maintained their traditional nomadic way of life based on the bison hunt. And this word here, nomadic, means that they would move around. So they would follow the bison, they would hunt them, and then they would follow them some more, and they would hunt them, and then every place that they went, they would go and they would kind of set up a temporary community and then follow the bison wherever they went. And really the only white people in the region, the only kind of European-descended people in the region, were fur traders as well as some American whiskey traders. You know, whiskey is a very strong form of alcohol. So I want you to look at this picture here and think to yourself this question. How are the Plains Indigenous people hunting bison before guns are available to them? Well, as you can see, they are using these horses, and before horses they would have just kind of used their bodies and kind of ran towards them. But they're spooking these buffalo, so the buffalo are scared, the bison are scared, and they jump off the cliff, and of course when they fall to the ground they're dead, right? So they're hunting these bison, and of course what the native people would do then is they would very quickly butcher them. So they very quickly would take the meat and take the furs and take the bones and take every part of this bison to be able to use it. However, there was a new piece of technology that was introduced that changed the bison hunt forever. So what do you think the effect of having guns, a growing population, and having horses were on bison population? You know, if you've got a horse and you've got a gun and there's a lot more of you, it's a lot easier to hunt bison. And pretty quickly, the bison were driven almost to the edge of extinction. And this photo is a photo of just thousands and thousands and thousands of bison skulls that were piled up in the plains by European hunters, as well as Métis hunters, as well as Indigenous hunters who were rapidly driving these bison to extinction. More than that, the Indigenous communities were hurt by smallpox and other European diseases, which killed many people. Some of the other things that they were hurt by were the increased American settlement south of the border. So the Americans were filling in kind of the southern plains more quickly than the Canadians were filling in the northern plains. And they were forcing Indigenous people off the land so that they could start up farms. There was also trade in alcohol, which most Indigenous people had never had before, and which caused lots of problems, right? It's hard to provide for your family if you're spending a lot of your money on drink. And, you know, alcohol was not a part of Indigenous culture, so when the Europeans introduced it, it had a really negative effect. And another one is the overhunting of the bison using guns. which is making the source of their traditional food, clothing, and shelter go extinct. So, around this time, and Manitoba has joined Canada, Prime Minister Sir John A. Macdonald decided to organize a police force to maintain order in the Northwest, to stop American whiskey traders from coming in, and protect settlers and railway workers. And this police force was called the Northwest Mounted Police, which is today what we call the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or the RCMP. So if you look at this painting here, what are the police officers doing in this painting? What are they dumping? Well, in this painting, what they're doing is they're dumping some sort of alcohol into the river. And part of the reason they would have done that is that many of the Indigenous people did not want so much alcohol kind of being traded to people in their nations by these American whiskey traders. And so the Canadian government and the NWMP, the Northwest Mounted Police, made a really strong effort to kind of stop people from importing this liquor and from spreading it around. They did other things as well, however. This police force was called the Northwest Mounted Police. They were called mounted because they rode horses. So if you're mounted, that means you're sitting on something. So they were mounted, they rode horses. In 1873, the first Mounties left to go west. There were only 150 men to maintain order across the entire prairies. Here's a Heritage Minute about a famous Mountie. And this Mountie, this is in the very far north of Canada, in the Alaska-Canada border, where the Yukon Gold Rush was taking place.
So he sits there in his red coat, all spitting polished, and he says,
Where would you be going?
Well, I'm going to the Klondike to look at your gold fields, if there really is any.
Not with this gambling gear and those revolvers. Men don't wear pistols in Canada.
Canada be damned. I'm going to the Klondike.
The Klondike is Canada. Pack those pistols in your saddlebags or get back to U.S. territory.
I'm an American. You can't do this to me.
In that case, I'll be lenient. We'll keep this gambling gear and you'll be back in the United States by sundown.
He never drew no gun. I could have shot that guy right there. Who was he anyway?
Superintendent Sam Steele of the Northwest Mounted Police.
Why didn't I shoot him? Damn it.
In the days of the gold rush, a policeman, Sam Steele, became a legend of the Klondike.
I don't know. Why didn't I shoot him?
So you can see kind of in that entertaining clip, right, that there's all these kind of, there's all this kind of instability, right, in that case because of the gold rush up in the Yukon, but also in like Saskatchewan, Manitoba, Alberta, there would have been so many American whiskey traders coming up, and it would have just made it really unstable. So one of the jobs of the RCMP, or at the time the Northwest Mounted Police, was to try to prevent that instability and to maintain order, to maintain peace, law, and order across the prairies, and also up in the Northwest Territories. Now they had another goal, and their other goal was to persuade Indigenous peoples in the West to sign treaties with Canada that would allow settlement on their lands. Now a treaty is a kind of an agreement that you sign between two people that says, okay, well, we're going to do this or we're going to do that. So you might think of the treaty after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham, where the French said, okay, we're going to give you Quebec in return for this little island in the Caribbean. So a treaty, and they were trying to get the Indigenous leaders to sign these treaties with them and said, okay, well, we'll give you the land, you'll give us the land, and we'll give you something else, was at least the way the British and the Northwest Mounted Police thought about what was going on. So the treaties usually offered money, supplies, reserve land, protection, and education for the children in return for an agreement to, quote, cede, release, surrender, and yield up to Her Majesty the Queen and successors forever all the lands. And this is Treaty 1. So there were a bunch of different treaties, but this is one of the treaties. And this is a direct quotation from it. And so it basically says, we'll give up all this land in return for some money, for some supplies, for some land that's going to be reserved for us, for the protection of the government, and for education for our children. And so they were asking them to sign these at this time, and the Northwest Mounted Police were the ones kind of leading that. Now, if you look at this, this is actually a really, really interesting part of this treaty. So if you look at the bottom here, it says, well, up here it says, signed at Rocky Mountain House on the 12th of May, let's see, which year was that? 18, it's kind of hard to read. 1850? No, I guess that's 1950. But the long and short of it is, right over here, the people are signing, but they're not signing with their pens or pencils or their actual names. This name is written by somebody who's witnessing it. They're signing with an X. And what that tells us is that these people who were signing these treaties could not read or write. They were illiterate. So they had never had the chance to actually read what was in this document that they were signing. They just kind of had to take the word of the Europeans, of these Canadian Northwest Mounted Police officers, that what they were saying was in fact true. That what the Northwest Mounted Police was saying was in the treaty was actually in the treaty. And if you think about Fishtail from the Birch Bark House, the book we read earlier this year, remember how he, in the story, one of the reasons he went to school was that he wanted to learn how to speak, the Chimukuman language, so that he could prevent the Americans or the Canadians from cheating his people in the treaty signing. Now, another way that you could think of writing something out would be with pictures. And this is Chief Pasqua, and he was recording what he thought was going to be the result of Treaty 4. And so over here, we've got this written document, and over here, we have this picture document. My point of telling you all this is that Indigenous peoples interpret the treaties differently. So the Canadian government said, okay, well, you agreed to cede, release, and surrender up to Her Majesty the Queen and successors forever all the lands. But Indigenous people say, no, we said that we would live together and share the land, not give it away entirely. So just want you to think for a moment. So was it fair for the Canadian government to negotiate these treaties with people when they were so weakened? So you have to remember the Canadian government was not going in and negotiating with Native people who were strong and powerful and all that sort of thing. It was negotiating with people who had just been hurt by smallpox, by this terrible epidemic, by people who they could see that their land was being taken away from them by these settlers coming in on the railroad. They could see that their traditional hunting grounds were being taken, and also that their traditional kind of source of food and way of life was being destroyed by the extinction of the buffalo. The other question is, has the Canadian government always lived up to the promises it made? So the Canadian government said, oh, no, you give us the land and we promise that we'll take care of you. And has the Canadian government always done that? So here's another Heritage Minute that kind of gives a different perspective on the treaties.
Treaty in Cree is Naskumituin, an oral agreement, and our agreements were always spoken. For George Spence, the core of treaty was Wichiheoin, to help one another.
And so we, the commissioners,
He was there for the making of Treaty 9, where the Cree were told,
we will honor this agreement together for as long as the sun shines and the waters flow.
the Cree made their mark because they were assured that the land would be shared, and they would always be able to harvest what they needed. George Spence was my great-grandfather. In his life, he saw many promises of the treaty go unfulfilled.
Treaties were essential to the creation of Canada. First Nations still fight for the agreements to be honored.
So here's a map of the different numbered treaties. And they're numbered just because they kind of happen in order. So the first one is happening here in 1871 in southern Manitoba, the second, and then the third, and then they kind of spread out all around kind of parts of Western Canada. And if you notice, I think this is interesting, what areas of Canada are not covered by a treaty? Well, over here, you can see that almost all of British Columbia is not covered by one of the treaties. So that we have a very different situation in British Columbia than some other parts of the country. The Maritimes are also not covered by treaties, but I think part of that is because by the time Europeans came there so much earlier, and even earlier on, the Europeans didn't even pretend that they were going to have an agreement. They just kind of took the land. There's also some treaties that were signed in Quebec and some that were signed in other parts of Ontario. And then one more modern treaty is basically the Nunavut is, in a sense, the world's largest reserve because it is this territory that is also the kind of the homeland of the Inuit people. In any case, I want to talk about British Columbia for a minute. So many parts of Canada are covered by treaties, but most of BC is not. Most Indigenous people in British Columbia have never signed a treaty with Canada, and many are still negotiating them. So here you can see in 2009, Tsawwassen, right where the ferry terminal is, they signed an agreement, the Indigenous people there signed an agreement with the Government of Canada. And you can see there's a similarity here between Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, where this Indigenous chief is meeting with the representatives from the Northwest Mounted Police and the Canadian government to sign a treaty. So there's kind of the same kind of thing. And our local First Nation in kind of the part of Vancouver that our school is in, the Musqueam, they are negotiating a treaty with the Crown, which is another name for the Government of Canada. So the Musqueam have never signed a treaty with the Crown, which is another name, which is, the Government of Canada. To switch focus a bit from the treaties, I want to talk about something that happened in 1885 on the prairies. So you remember Louis Riel and the Métis. So many Métis people had started to move west to Saskatchewan after Manitoba joined Confederation. However, they could still not escape the pressure of English-Canadian settlement from Ontario, and many of them worried that the federal government would take away their land when the railway came through Saskatchewan. And if you look here at this satellite map, you can see the French Canadians and the Métis, they organized their land in these long strips kind of connected to the river, whereas the English Canadians tended to organize their land in these squares. And the Métis were really worried that the English would come in, they'd reorganize their land, they'd take away part of their land, and they'd give it to these new English settlers. So in 1885, several Métis leaders asked Louis Riel to come back to Canada and lead them as they rebelled against the government to protect their rights. Riel declared himself in charge of the provisional government in Saskatchewan and organized a Métis militia to attack the Northwest Mounted Police and Hudson Bay Company posts. He hoped this would force the Canadian government to respect the Métis people's rights and land. Now, the rebellion was really controversial. That means that people had different opinions on it among the Métis and other Indigenous peoples. Some of them wanted peace, but others felt they had to fight for their rights. Riel was very religious, and he saw himself as a prophet, but most of the Catholic Church leaders disagreed and encouraged the Métis to stay out of the rebellion. Now, the Prime Minister, Sir John A. Macdonald, organized a new militia to be sent from Ontario and Quebec on the parts of the Canadian Pacific Railway that were already built. These volunteers battled with the rebels and eventually defeated them. So here's an image of, I think, the Battle of Frog Lake in Saskatchewan, or what's today Saskatchewan. At the time, it was just the Northwest Territory. And it is the Northwest Mounted Police fighting against these rebels, these Métis rebels, and eventually the Northwest Mounted Police, who had far more supplies and far more people, were able to crush the rebellion. So they captured Riel, and they charged him with treason. And treason basically means you've betrayed your country, an offense which at the time carried the death penalty. This was very controversial, because most French Canadians, who you got to remember, they were Catholic, they spoke French, just like Louis Riel, they thought he was a good man, while most English Canadians thought he was a traitor. And there was a real division in the opinion on this based on language and culture. So I want to show you this cartoon here from the 1880s. It was from a Canadian newspaper. And you can see over here you've got Sir John A. Macdonald, and over here it says English influence and French influence. And he's kind of being pulled on two sides by Louis Riel, because the Canadian government had to make a decision as to were they going to push through the death penalty for Louis Riel now that he'd been captured. And it was a really, really controversial thing at this time, because the French basically thought he was fighting for his people, he's a freedom fighter, and the English thought, well, no, he rebelled against his country, he's a rebel. So if you don't want to watch this next Heritage Minute, you can skip ahead for a minute, because it's kind of, it's a bit of a sad one. And there's kind of a moment at the end that's a little graphic. But this kind of answers the story of how the Canadian government decided to treat Louis Riel.
I forgive them with all my heart as I ask God to forgive me.
The verdict is clear. You're guilty of high treason.
But let them remember that I struggled for the Métis, for the people of Manitoba and the Northwest.
There can be no excuse for
The
what
Métis
you've
are not
done.
birds.
It requires you to answer for it.
We have a right to God's lands.
Ego te absolvo peccatis tu.
Insane.
In nomine
I have battled an insane and irresponsible
You
government.
will be taken to the place appointed.
Perhaps I am a prophet. I suffered enough.
By the neck until you are dead.
tua sicut in cielo et in terra.
I struggled not only for myself, but for the rights of my people.
Louis
the
Riel
Métis.
led our Métis nation, and he gave us hope and strength and pride.
As we also forgive our debtors. And lead us,
Lead us
not
not into temptation, but deliver us from evil.
So to this day, Louis Riel remains a controversial figure because many people see him as one of the fathers of Confederation. He brought Manitoba into Confederation and he fought for the rights of his people. Whereas some people, I guess kind of a minority today, still think that his rebellion against the government was the wrong thing. I think today it would be very difficult for a court to convict him of high treason, and we certainly would not have hung him today. But it was a different time, and that's kind of what happened. So it's still one of those things that's kind of a historic wound in our country. We're going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the completion of the railway and immigration to the West. So after the rebellion was crushed, the railway proceeded easily. The famous last spike was put into the railway in 1885, and the first trains left Montreal, Quebec on June 28, 1886, arriving in Port Moody, BC on July 4, 1886. The railway and the treaties allowed new European settlers to move into the prairies and farm the land. So if you look at this poster here, this is a poster the Canadian government put up in many parts of Europe in the 1890s and the 1900s. And I want you to think for a minute, what kind of message is it trying to show? How do you know? So I'll point out a few things. Western Canada, the new El Dorado. El Dorado is kind of like the magical land of gold, if you remember. Homes for everybody, easy to reach because of the railway. Nothing to fear, protected by the government because of the Northwest Mounted Police. This is your opportunity. Why not embrace it? Free 160 acres of farmland. So what they're trying to say here is like, come, this is a wonderful place. We want to fill up this land with farmers. And so this is advertising. Come to Saskatchewan, come to Manitoba, come to Alberta, come to the western part of Canada. We want you. And they called it the last best West. And if you notice here, this one is advertised, I think this is in Dutch. So they were advertising to many people in Europe. So the federal government wanted to fill the land as quickly as possible. And the Canadian Pacific Railway wanted to make a profit. So they sold thousands of acres of farmland in what is now Manitoba, Alberta, and Saskatchewan for relatively cheap prices. Between 1880 and 1910, I guess it would actually, you know what, I'm going to correct that. It'd be about 1920. Or not 1920, it'd be 1914 when the First World War started. So between 1880 and 1914, the federal government admitted millions of refugees and immigrants from Europe and gave them inexpensive land for farms in the western provinces. So I just want to show you this video produced by kind of the government about immigration a few years ago.
According to 2016 census data, 7.5 million people born abroad reported coming to Canada through the immigration process, a proportion of more than 1 in 5 people. This is close to the proportion of 22.3% observed in the 1921 census, a record high since Canadian Confederation. The 1871 census enumerated approximately 600,000 foreign-born individuals, 16.1% of the total population, the majority of whom were from the United Kingdom and Ireland, followed distantly by the United States, Germany, and France. At the beginning of the 20th century, Canada's borders expanded and the country encouraged an influx of immigrants to settle in the prairies, British Columbia, and the territories. As a result, the foreign-born population rose significantly, especially up to the beginning of World War I, to nearly 2 million people in 1921. At that time, immigrants were mostly from the British Isles, but the proportion of immigrants from other European countries, mainly Eastern Europe, rose, which altered the ethnocultural profile of various regions. Immigration slowed between 1931 and 1945 due to the economic crisis of the 1930s and World War II. Renewed economic activity and immigration marked the post-war period. Between 1945 and 1980, Canada welcomed many immigrants from Germany, the Netherlands, Italy, and Greece, who settled primarily in Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec. Starting in the 1960s, various international events, as well as changes to immigration policy, including the introduction of the points system, led to Canada opening its doors to more immigrants from other countries. In 2016, immigrants had more than 200 places of birth. The majority of people who arrived between 2011 and 2016, 61.8%, were born in Asia, including the Middle East. The leading countries of birth of recent immigrants were the Philippines, India, and China. On account of the shift in the source countries of immigration, the composition of the population of each province and territory has become more diverse and has made Canada what it is today. To learn more about the 2016 census results for your community, visit www.statcan.gc.ca/census.
And so you know, a census is a way of counting kind of the people that live in a given country. And what they're saying there is basically that there was this huge wave of immigration that took place in the early part of the or the late part of the 1800s and the early part of the 1900s, and that basically the same thing kind of continues today. That, you know, Canada continues to welcome many immigrants from around the world. So if you look at this chart here, this is kind of another way of seeing it. This is a chart that shows how many immigrants were admitted to Canada every year. So if you look, at this chart, this is kind of the pre-Confederation people. And here, like, there are people who are coming over, right? We talked about the Irish and whatnot. But you're looking at like 25,000, 30,000 in a good year, kind of people that are coming over. And then you get to the 1870s and more people start coming. And then there's this first wave of people who are immigrating from Europe after Confederation, maybe more than 100,000 in a few years. But then here is where it really takes off. From 1900 to about 1912, you have this giant number, this huge wave of immigration. It's like something we've never seen. And then since the Second World War, we've basically had immigration every year. And since kind of the 1990s when I was born, it's been pretty stable. You know, obviously it's gone up and down, but the number of immigrants we've admitted every year has been relatively stable. Now, the immigrants that were admitted at this time, in the late 1800s, early 1900s, many of them were very poor, and they had very little opportunity back in Europe. For them, coming to Canada was a chance to build a better life for their families. Many of these people came from Ontario, Quebec, and the Atlantic provinces, but others came from all over the world. They came from the United States, from Ireland, from Britain, from Germany, from Ukraine, from Poland. Now, there were not many trees in the prairies, so when they got there, after, you know, if you're coming from Europe, you're getting on this boat, and you're traveling in this boat overnight for over weeks to get to Quebec. Then you're getting out, you're getting on a train, you're taking the train for several days, and then you're probably walking to the plot of land that you bought from the government. And when you get there, you realize it's just flat and grassy. So what they did is there were not very many trees in the prairie, so they made sod houses out of the soil. They cut pieces of soil into bricks and piled them on top of each other. You can kind of see here's a more modern imagination of it, but basically they cut up the sod, which is like the soil with grass in it, and they piled that on top of each other to make the first houses.
Where are they? Look, over there!
Anna, it's a safe, flat country everywhere.
In the 1890s, a wave of European immigrants arrived on the Canadian prairies. Eat, it's good.
Anna, Is it baby? You all right?
Janek, Mrs. Kovac, she has toilet paper on the roof.
One day we have toilet paper also.
Many built their first house from the same earth that would grow their bread. They called it a sari.
So you can see these people are obviously not rich, or people who are coming over from Eastern Europe without very much opportunity where they're from. And they come here and, you know, on the one hand, they've got this relatively cheap land. They can own their own farm for their first time. But on the other hand, they get there and it's empty. It's just grass. It's just grass. So they have to build this home, and they do. And that's why if you were to ever drive through Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba, you would find these vast fields of wheat and of canola and of corn and of all this kind of thing, because they were able to start these giant farms that turned Western Canada into the breadbasket of the world. So by 1905, the population of the Northwest was large enough for two new provinces, Alberta and Saskatchewan. But I want to give you here a picture of just kind of what life might have been like in some of these little communities. And one of the ways that we can do that is we can think a bit about how the schools would have operated. And here I think is a kind of a really good way of thinking about what it would have been like to be a child or to be a person who was living on the prairies at this time.
Children. You must understand, young woman, that you work for us and not the other way round.
But you would like to tell me how I must go about teaching the children to read.
I've told you what it is we want you to do, and that's enough.
Please, Mr. Clarence, would you take a look at this?
You'll not bother me with that.
No, but you see, sir, your son read this today. It is quite a difficult passage. It is from the Bible. This is what I use to teach him to read.
Ah, Mr. Clarence, why don't you just read it then?
Both of you know I cannot read a word.
Throughout most of our history, millions of Canadians have owed their education to young women who taught in one-room schoolhouses, much like this one.
So I wanted to show you that video just because I think it's an incredible, it gives you a little bit of a picture of kind of what life would have been like at this time. So you've got this group of older men from the community who are meeting together, and they're the school board. They run the school. They're like the PEC at our school. And you've got the one teacher that they've hired, and they're trying to boss her around and tell her what to do. But of course, you know, they're poor farmers, right? So one of them, you know, he's not even able to read himself. And of course, even in the public schools at that point, the way that you would have taught reading or writing or anything like that would have been with the Bible. So I think it's just kind of an interesting picture into what that time in our history would have been like, as you've got all these different things going on. For Indigenous peoples, this was a disaster. For these new immigrants, it was a time of hope and of change. For the country, it was a time of expansion and getting bigger. And so it's a complicated, difficult time, but it's also a time of great hope for some people. So I'm going to leave you off there, grade 5, and we're going to pick up next week talking about lesson 9. And in lesson 9, we're going to talk about kind of what happens after 1914 when you have this moment of the world wars. You've got World War I followed by World War II. Thank you for listening.